and it will be published or made available afterwards. And I say that because we had one meeting where one gentleman chose to use some language that was probably inappropriate, not anything too bad, but just know that if you open your mouth and say something silly, that will be recorded. So just keep that in mind. Please use if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you go to participant, if you're on a computer, there's a little blue hand, raise hand feature. You can raise it or lower it. If that's not working for you, please put something in the chat. If you have a question for our speaker once we get into the Q&A period, and I will call on people and unmute them as we go through. I'll try to mute people as I see them unmuting, but it would be helpful if you're not asking a question to keep yourself muted. It just kind of cuts down on background noise and what have you.
Where is the blue hand?
This is, if you click on participants, you'll see a little, where is the blue hand? Where's the blue hand?
You have to have the participant box open. Down at the bottom, there's a participants chat, share screen.
I see it.
Yeah, so.
Okay. Thanks.
Perfect. What else? So I think almost everybody had joined when I talked about Wake County having 13 people running for the 16 NCGA seats. We have Adrian for North Carolina House 11 and Travis running for North Carolina Senate 17 on this call. And again, the issues that we're collectively kind of focusing on this year are educational freedom, i.e. school choice, and making sure parents are empowered to choose what's right for what they feel is best for their child. We're focusing on privatizing the ABC system. There's simply no need for it anymore. And then the last one is housing affordability, and that encompasses a lot of stuff. One of the things we're kind of focused on is land use regulation and zoning, because it really, how cities grow and what they permit and where and what have you, has an impact on our communities. And I think a lot of times we focus sometimes on things that are national and forget that, you know, if you look around, it's how your city, your community, your neighborhoods are growing or not growing, and who can afford to be where. That's just as important as what we're doing overseas and what have you. So with that in mind, our guest speaker tonight is Jason Harden from the City of Raleigh Planning Department. Really sharp guy. I've heard him do numerous presentations before. Really enjoy him. But a couple things before he gets going. He has the expertise, the training, the knowledge. He can explain why certain policies are the way they are. He has some history there. But we've had some confusion before. One or two people. Planning department does not approve or disapprove per se. They are not running the show themselves. So if you ask why something has happened or why that's in place, certainly the context, the history, the discussion is there. But just remember, ultimately, and maybe he'll get into this one more, your city planning department is not the approval authority for everything. A lot of that goes through a planning commission and Raleigh City Council. I know this is Wake County Libertarian Party, but with Raleigh right there in the heart, and so many of these issues existing also in other parts of Wake County, be it Garner, Carrier, what have you, I think it's important for people who don't understand how some of these policies work at the local level to take the time to listen. And since this may not be the issue that many of you are most familiar with, I do ask that you really pay attention, maybe even take a few notes and be ready to ask some great questions afterwards. And unless somebody feels I have forgotten some key part of this intro, I will turn it over to Jason, going once, going twice. And again, guys, remember, we'll be back at Tobacco Road soon enough, and this will be much more fun with burgers and beers. But until then, I will turn it over to Jason Harden.
All right, thank you, David. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Great, well, it's good to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Always glad to talk about these issues. And I do hope you take up David's challenge to ask some tough questions. Always enjoy that. And I think this is a great topic. So I'm actually going to share my screen. I put together, or is that a possibility here? I see host disabled participant screen sharing. David,
Brad
maybe
is
I
on
could,
that right now.
if that's
Yep,
something you
Brad
can
and I are
adjust, or I could send it to you.
No, we're gonna make you.
Yes.
Brad, are you giving him the power to share his screen, or you give Brad 3 seconds? I seem unable to delegate. Brad?
I see a thumbs up.
Okay, you should be able to now.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Sorry about that.
No problem. As far as online meeting glitches and hurdles, that was pretty minor. I think we're all getting used to doing this. And so I have created some slides, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. I would be really glad to, again, take some questions at the end. And I've probably loaded up too many slides on here, but I did have a lot of ground I wanted to cover, but I'll also go through them pretty quickly. David suggested, and I thought it was a great idea, to begin with a little bit of the history of zoning, which it sheds some light on some of the questions that we deal with today. So thinking back on it, for most of human history, there really wasn't much of a perceived need for it. It started to arise when you have the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and cities are suddenly getting much bigger, much more industrial, and there's a rise of perceived conflicts between land uses. And the way that those were handled at the time was typically with a nuisance law. Okay, so your factory is putting out smoke or odors that are making my property unlivable. I am going to sue you for you either to stop doing that or compensate me in some way. And that's the way that those kind of conflicts were handled. Well, that over time began to be perceived as a pretty slow, inefficient way of addressing those conflicts by cities and by people who saw those conflicts. And in the early 1900s, there started to be the idea of, rather than handling those through lawsuits and the legal system, to essentially preempt those conflicts through regulation. And what started to happen is very quickly those regulations branched out from just that original concept of, well, that slaughterhouse next door sure doesn't smell good, to this taller building. And that's the slide is showing an example of a building in New York that led to their zoning law there. Buildings that were perceived as casting shadows or having impacts in more general ways. So use started to become a much more focal point of how zoning evolved. And by the 1920s, these ordinances started to become more and more common, and the United States Department of Commerce even put out a guide, a standard zoning act, which really spread this practice pretty quickly across the country. And it was based on, all these were based on the idea that the regulation is justified as what's sometimes called the police power, not police department per se, but the power of government to regulate something when it protects public health, moral safety, and general welfare. And those are still the foundations upon which these regulations are justified today. So there was a challenge, and this was really the key challenge and the last one that got to the Supreme Court in the 1920s. And this is a town in Ohio, a suburb of Cleveland, that had created a zoning ordinance, kind of similar to a lot of modern ordinances. It separated uses, including not just industrial from residential, but much more specific about where certain types of residential buildings could be built. And the court, interestingly, it was not a unanimous decision. It was pretty well split, and there were some very interesting dissents. But the majority opinion said that this is reasonable, and it got into a lot of interesting language about different housing types. And it noted that very often apartment houses, this is the court's language, are a mere parasite constructed in order to take advantage of open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of the district. And it went on to talk in that similar vein about why it would be justified to separate those uses from other residential uses. And so what's happened since then, particularly after World War II and the widespread adoption of the automobile, allowed in a physical and a transportation way uses to be even more defined and widely spread out. Zoning codes got a lot more complicated, and sometimes you have dozens or more of different zones that are applied in a city, different commercial zones, different residential zones, sometimes several hundred pages for a zoning ordinance. So often very difficult for people to understand and to apply, and tended to separate uses ever more rigidly from one another. But that's something that recently, and by recently I mean maybe last decade or two, there's been some rethinking about that, where many cities have realized that always separating all these uses had some unintended consequences in terms of transportation impacts, how easy it is to get around, carbon emissions, and so on. So a lot of them, and even just responding to consumer demand. So a lot of them have revised those codes to allow more of a mix of uses and to allow higher densities, at least in centers or corridors. So in Raleigh, think about, say, a North Hills area or Hillsborough Street. And recently there have been more questions about what's sometimes called exclusionary zoning, where if you think about it, certain zoning districts that require a minimum lot size, so require that someone own or be able to afford a certain amount of land before they can live there, is that excluding people of different incomes from living in a city or a particular part of the city. That's become a question that increasingly is being debated. And then the last one, and that's what the graphic matches up to, is something that the buzzword now is missing middle. And that reflects the fact that even when there's some zoning that allows more density in those centers and corridors, often there's nothing in between that and the very low density detached houses that are large parts of a city. And that codes can be rewritten to allow a greater variety of housing types. They're kind of in between that multi-story apartment on one hand and the low density detached house on the other hand. And that's something that you may have heard about, that debate in Seattle or Portland, and it's something that the city of Raleigh is exploring as well. And I have a few slides later on that'll touch on the current status of that question in Raleigh. So that's just a little bit in general about zoning, and I'm going to zip through some slides here about how Raleigh in particular has grown, because it has its own unique story of growth. It's very different compared to a northeastern city or some cities that were larger before World War II. And this was the original plan for Raleigh. It's a very, it's a unique city in that it didn't just organically happen. It was planned. There was a map before there was anything in Raleigh, because it was designed as the capital city. And so you had, this is downtown, you had a grid of streets leading to those squares at the Capitol and Nash and the other squares, some of which are now occupied by different uses, Moore Square, and then the governor's mansion. You can see that original plan, and then since then, and that plan area is what's outlined in pink there. And over time, Raleigh has grown. It grew very slowly for the first couple hundred years. It was a government that didn't meet all that frequently. The legislature was designed to be somewhat inaccessible and to not do a lot. So Raleigh accordingly grew pretty slow. But by the 1900s, it was starting to be kind of a big little town. This is Fayetteville Street. And as NC State became a larger and larger university, you started to see much more rapid growth. And Raleigh grew in a very particular way. Here's another look at Fayetteville Street. Some of y'all might remember what this looked like in the 1970s when it was pedestrianized. And then the city as a whole continuing to spread out pretty rapidly. And this is just the city of Raleigh, not counting the other bordering municipalities. And here's Fayetteville Street today. So Raleigh's turned into a pretty significant city, and a lot of growth is going to continue to happen. People are moving here for opportunities, for job opportunities. They're staying here because there's jobs here. People are moving here because they find it to be a welcoming and diverse city. So a lot of reasons that people are coming here, and that population increase certainly going to continue to be a trend in the future. So with that, I want to talk about just a couple of current initiatives that involve questions about planning and zoning. And one of the primary ones, and this is something that's, it has some pretty citywide implications, and it's looking at transit and transit plans. And of course, we've now learned that land use and transportation really have to be considered together. They're really the same topic, can't be considered in abstract. And so in 2016, county voters decided to fund the Wake County Transit Plan, which included expanding frequent bus service. We have a little bit of that now, but expanding that to a much wider area. Starting to look at commuter rail from Garner to downtown, out to Cary and Morrisville, and then ultimately out to Durham. So still some feasibility planning for that project. But the biggest project that's moving ahead now is what we call bus rapid transit. And that's the idea of giving buses, for the most part, their own space on the street, that there are stations rather than stops, that you pay before you board, just to make everything quicker and more efficient, and provide a pretty significant boost in mobility for people who are using transit right now. So there are currently 4 corridors where bus rapid transit is being planned, all extending out from downtown, New Bern to the east, a corridor along Capitol to the north, south towards Garner, and then west connecting with downtown Cary. And so that's raised some pretty big questions, and they connect these two issues together. One of which is, with that investment, how to maximize, how to leverage the benefits of that investment, and how to think about what percentage of the city future growth should take place along those corridors rather than in a place where driving is the only option, and how to think about sharing those benefits. And as the city's population continues to grow, and as these investments are being made, there's a pretty strong connection between those two issues. And that's what we've been doing a lot of planning to think about. So again, I mentioned that Raleigh's grown in a really specific way, which is outward. And that has a lot of different implications. Implications for obviously how that land is used, for carbon emissions, definitely has implications for affordability. Because what we've seen, unlike the 1950s and 60s, let's say, when I think commutes were a little shorter and many people were very content to always drive, there's been a trend more recently for more walkable lifestyles. That people are, not everybody, but many people are looking to do that for their health, just because they prefer those kinds of areas. And so demand for those spaces, which Raleigh did not create a whole lot of in its history, is getting to be really high. We didn't make many of them. And now, because of that, because of the limited amount of housing there, you start to see pretty significant increases in housing costs. Because when there's not enough of something, homes in this case, and everyone is competing for them, supply and demand says that costs will go up. People get priced out, they have to travel further. There's all sorts of consequences that flow from that. So one thing that is a part of addressing that, it's not the only one, we don't think, but more housing is a part of that solution, and it's going to be impossible to solve that issue without one of many steps being to allow more housing to be built. And so what we've tried to think about with the community in this process is, what are the trade-offs here in how we grow in the future? So in the past, we grew in a very specific way around driving and spreading out, and that worked for a lot of people. But in the future, as we continue to add people, and again, the question isn't whether the city grows, but how. Should the city grow more around transit or more around driving? Where should we allow more people to live? And it means thinking through trade-offs. There are pros and cons to them. So growing more around driving, it does mean less change around those places where bus rapid transit and those transit stations are being planned. It does mean more change, though, in places on the edge of the city or other municipalities adjacent to Raleigh. Does mean more driving, more carbon emissions, other air pollutants. Does mean walking is less of an option for a lot of people because the distances are just too far. On the flip side, growing more around transit does mean more change around transit stations. And obviously change can be something that can be uncomfortable. And there's trade-offs that come with that. Does mean less driving per person, fewer carbon emissions, allows more people to live that walkable lifestyle, creates more housing options, can connect transit users to job opportunities, and it also supports that community investment in transit. So we've heard from a lot of people, maybe some of you on this call participated in this process, ask a lot of questions to try and gauge what people thought about it. We ask, is it important to ensure that there's some affordable housing options near this high level of transit? High percentage of people said yes. We ask a really specific trade-off question. Would people support more change, taller buildings, if that would mean that housing affordability could be improved? And again, that answer was yes. And should a broader range of housing types be allowed in those more residential areas near BRT? So that might mean where there are only detached houses, allowing accessory dwelling units or allowing duplexes or something that's a residential scale, but does allow some additional and more affordable housing types. And then we asked just in general, the idea about growing around transit, what do people think about that? And we asked, do people currently live, and this is in the Raleigh that we now live in, do they currently live in a place where walking is an option and there's frequent transit? Most people didn't, but would they like to? And a huge percentage, and there's some self-selection here to be sure, but I think this kind of reflects what we hear from a lot of different perspectives. A lot of people would like that kind of lifestyle, which again goes back to the issue where we're seeing there just is not enough of those places where people can walk to destinations and that kind of transit exists. So that led to a lot of people say it is important that that zoning be looked at to allow more homes and jobs near transit. So that's kind of general and abstract. We're going to be doing a lot more planning around these stations and getting more specific about what that looks like. But these are some examples of places where there's a mix of uses, a very active kind of place, the kind of place that we're hearing people say that they would like to live in, different cities across the country. And walkability is really key. Every transit user, really every trip, begins and ends with a walk, even if it's just in a parking lot. But certainly for people using transit or getting around on foot, having a safe environment is pretty key. So that process is also talked, I mentioned one of the goals is to think about equitable sharing of that investment. So that's led to some more specific concepts for how to better ensure affordability. And I mentioned that there's been concerns about how zoning can be exclusionary. So the concept here is to continue to use that zoning tool, but in a way that it encourages affordability in a way that it doesn't right now. So one example being allowing additional housing to be built in exchange for additional height, in exchange for some percentage of affordable units. And that's something that is likely to be considered for application along these corridors in the future. And these are some next steps about that particular process. There's actually a report that's set to come out in the coming weeks, probably in July, and some additional planning along those corridors. And just before I close and take questions, wanted to mention a couple other current initiatives that kind of go to the same topic. I mentioned the missing middle concept before, and there are actually lots of these examples in existing, particularly older Raleigh neighborhoods, Boylan Heights, which is what you're seeing here, or Oakwood, or really in many parts of the city, but they're typically lost because often the existing zoning does not allow, these are non-conforming, as the term goes. New units can't be built in these zoning districts. So although there are, again, all these examples of quadruplexes that are at the same scale of detached houses or duplexes, and I'm showing some examples from across the city, it's not something that's currently allowed in those zoning districts. It is allowed, you could do these kinds of buildings in a more intensive zoning district. But nobody does that, because if someone can build a 4 or 5 story apartment building or a mixed use building, that's what's likely to happen rather than something like this. So that again goes back to that concept of how it's in the middle and there's not really a zone that accommodates that. So there are some pending regulatory changes that address that. One is accessory dwelling units. Planners always call these ADUs, but a backyard cottage or a granny flat are the terms that are sometimes used to describe that. So that's been something that's been discussed really the last several years. And the current discussion is about making those legal by right across the city. And the Planning Commission just recommended an ordinance change that would allow those to City Council, which will take that up in its next couple of meetings. Allowing duplexes to meet the same dimensional or spatial requirements as detached houses. So currently, typically they would require twice the land. So we see very, very, very few new duplexes. But that's, again, a housing type that is currently found, again, all over the city. It's just not something that can be done now. A similar approach with 3 or 4 unit buildings. So that's still at that same scale. That's more of a same scale as a typical detached house. Allowing townhouses in a broader range of residential districts, and reducing parking requirements in downtown, near transit, and for housing in general. So those parking requirements, obviously the intent is to reduce the idea of spillover parking, where a new building has high demand for parking and it blocks other, it takes up the space along the streets. But one thing that the city can do in that situation is require a residential parking permit. And what's been realized over the last few decades is there's some unintended consequences to those parking requirements. It tends to, because when someone buys a house or a condominium or rents one, typically the parking isn't priced separately, you get it all. So if you don't use the parking, you're sort of wasting that that you've already spent your money on. So it tends to encourage parking and driving and car ownership. And for those who don't own a car or own one car for a household instead of 2, tends to act as a subsidy from people who are not car owners to people who are car owners. And maybe that's desirable, but I think that implication should be thought through rather than just sort of accepted without thinking about it. So that's all I wanted to cover, and I'd be happy to take questions about those particular projects or issues, or really any questions that y'all have about planning and development in general.
Yeah, so I'll start looking for hands. If you want to stop screen sharing, I'll go with my participant screen and look for a moment.
I think we have some questions.
So thank you.
Can we start with those?
Yep, we'll get to those in 3 seconds. So thank you, Jason, for the presentation as we get into these. For those of you who maybe are not sure, again, why we're doing this, from our perspective as a political organization, you caught there at the end, I hope, a lot of the stuff that would be by right. That's basically expanding the right of the individual who owns the property to put an ADU there, to put a duplex there, to put a triplex there, what have you. Expanded opportunities for townhomes. There's quite a few reasons. Oregon is a state, for those of you running for NCGA, Oregon is a state that has moved into the direction of allowing more things like duplexes by right. And it also needs to be emphasized when you have regulatory hurdles or local groups of some neighborhoods, let's be honest, are much stronger in the sense that they're better organized, the neighbors are more active politically, they maybe donate more and what have you, and can speak with a larger voice and a greater voice before Raleigh City Council when there's exceptions that are requested. That tends to favor, again, an older established homeowner, and it tends to favor then bigger developers who can wait out that process. And that's made it hard even now, even when something is allowed. In some cases, I've had some smaller developers tell me it's harder to secure financing. So the reason we care, we as libertarians, is stronger property rights leads to greater economic freedom, leads to, hopefully over time, the market responding and creating more housing opportunities, more diverse housing opportunities. Because what you'll find, and I can get away with saying, is we have had in this city, at least in the recent history that I've followed city politics for 4 or 5 years, you have these neighborhoods that simply don't want this type of missing middle housing. They don't want renters in their neighborhood. There's an entitlement there, and that's what we need to confront and talk about as candidates. But I will get off my soapbox quickly and move on to questions. And Ace, I'll just let you ask your question. I know you typed it, but let me get you unmuted if you would be so kind. Ace,
Well,
yep, go ahead.
I'll take one at a time and let other people ask. The first one is, as libertarians, we always hear about Houston, city of Houston. They have no zoning laws. I'd like to, I guess, first find out how much of that is true. I've never lived in Houston. I don't know what it's really like there. And if it is true that Houston thrives with no zoning regulations, could Raleigh do the same thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Houston is a pretty unique example of a city that does not have a formal zoning code. I think it's a little bit less of a radical departure from other cities than it seems when you say that Houston doesn't have zoning. They do have other land use regulations. When you look at Houston, it doesn't necessarily look that different from other American cities. It's taken a kind of a similar pattern. So it's kind of hard to see exactly how much of a difference that's had. And one thing I do know that has happened in Houston is essentially they've created kind of a private system of zoning with a very extensive use of private covenants about how land can be used. And not saying that's good or bad, but I think it's interesting in the sense that even without a formal zoning code, I think in a sense they found kind of a workaround that provided what many people were looking for, which is, I think, a certainty about how nearby properties will be used in the future. So even without a formal public zoning law, in a sense, it hasn't really departed that much from the land use pattern that we've seen in other cities. But it is definitely a different model. There have not, to my knowledge, been any other major cities that have not adopted zoning. And today, even almost nearly all the smallest cities and even more rural counties have adopted that. So the trend has certainly been to continue to apply zoning to more and more places. And I think the counter trend has been less of a Houston trend and more of the examples that we've seen in Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, where there's been a really hard look at zoning that only permits detached houses and whether that served a city's broader goals or not. And so that's something that increasingly more and more cities, including Durham, just went through a process to take a look at that. I mentioned the ordinances in Raleigh. That seems to be much more the approach now. I think it's probably perceived as more of a bite-sized incremental change than something like a more extensive dezoning process would.
Okay. Our next question will be from Travis, if I can get him unmuted, and then we'll come back to Phil and Ace. I'm trying to unmute him. I'm trying. Travis, feel free to unmute yourself since the button's not working for me.
Hey.
Fantastic.
Jason, thanks for coming, by the way. I just had a quick question about the bus route planning and the idea of expanding the bus routes. Well, I lived in Atlanta for 12 years and we had MARTA. And in all of 12 years, I rode it one time to a Falcons game. And what we noticed was the buses kind of got in the way and they actually created more traffic by stopping frequently. It took at least twice as long to get anywhere. And I just don't see people taking the bus to and from work they're going to want to drive their cars. You can't rely on someone else, their timing and everything. And I would be opposed to expanding any type of bus routes for the simple fact that it's so darn expensive for very little value, and it actually makes traffic worse. And we don't have really any major sports around here, which makes it more convenient to just take a bus straight to the game, like a Falcons game or a Braves game, which that came in handy because it's $20 to park. And it's $5 to take the bus to and from. So it made sense. What is the value of adding all these bus lines all over the place?
Sure. And I think you're right that cars have traditionally been a very convenient option for people. And that's one of the reasons why I actually just took out a slide that showed what we call the mode share between different forms of transportation, driving, transit, walking, and so on. And Raleigh's driving share is pretty high compared to a lot of other American cities. And I think that reflects some of those advantages that driving has. But in terms of benefits of increased investment in buses, there's a couple. Again, I think it's everybody's decision whether or not they are worth the investment, but they certainly can reduce carbon emissions. If more people are taking public transit, that can be a more efficient way of transportation, can provide a more affordable means of transportation. If someone car ownership is pretty expensive. I've seen estimates, once you factor everything in, can cost $10,000 for a household. If a household can afford to, or can get along with one fewer car or no cars, and potentially a significant savings for that household. And then lastly, there's kind of a geometry issue too when it comes to cars. They're just not quite as spatially efficient as a bus system, at least a bus system that has pretty high ridership. And that depends on a lot of factors, like how easy it is to access the buses, how efficient and fast they are, and those things really matter. But when it comes to moving more people in a limited amount of space, transit can often do that better than cars can. But again, those are trade-offs, and reasonable people have kind of different weights that they would put on those different factors. But I guess the bottom line, though, is in terms of those transit investments, there was a referendum in 2016 to create a transit sales tax, which Wake County did pass. So that's funding a lot of these transit improvements that I talked about.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I guess one thing I'd be opposed to is the tax rates for very little value, but thank you for answering that question.
That's been passed. Phil will ask next. The only quick thing I'll add to that is if you look at the tax of bus rapid transit compared to what Durham tried with the light rail, so bus rapid transit is kind of easier to fix as you do it. I'm not a huge proponent, and with the dedicated lanes, if you're going to look at the cost of a government transportation plan, bus rapid transit compared to light rail is dramatically cheaper and allows a little more flexibility. You can kind of learn as you go. But with that in mind, I'm going to try to unmute Phil. And I think I did it. No, I didn't. That button doesn't work for me. Phil, if you could unmute yourself. There we go.
Yeah,
Thank
you
you.
actually muted me by accident. I already unmuted myself. I want to take the conversation in almost the exact opposite direction from what Travis did, using some of the same facts. The plan at the moment says rapid transit means government. All of it is government, planned by the central authority, either whether it's rail or buses or whatever. What is the thinking, if any, has been done about supplementing whatever version of transit is done by the government with private buses? Right now, as I understand it, you can have a taxi cab, but you cannot provide a bus service. If there was a bus service, it would be unlikely that these things would run, private buses would run as empty as city buses often do. And in addition to that, they would go in whatever places where there was a demand. At the moment, the buses don't go everywhere that people might want to take a bus. And as I've understood it, there's a trade-off. You either have full buses government run, or you have somewhat empty buses government run, depending on how much territory you want to cover. The private buses would go where the people want service, or they would simply abandon those markets if they really weren't markets. Is there any thinking at all that it would be possible to let private companies run buses in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the history of transit in the United States is a pretty interesting one. And I think one of the photos I showed from Fayetteville Street showed the streetcar tracks that ran down the center of it. And there was a fairly extensive streetcar network in Raleigh, as there was in a lot of other cities. And what happened is, over time, once after World War II, cars became more widely used, cities became more spread out. And they were privately run, those transit systems. They started to lose a lot of money. And essentially, they all folded, and governments decided that it was still an important service to be able to transport people, and something worth subsidizing with taxpayer money. And that's still the place that we're in today, where and I think your question is a good one. It gets at sometimes a topic that's discussed, and what are the goals of transit? Is it to run like a business and be as efficient as possible, or are the goals a little bit broader than that? Are they to provide mobility to people who might not have good mobility otherwise, or to serve locations that, even though they may not be quote unquote profitable, there's still some social value in providing that? And again, those aren't obvious right or wrong. Those are kind of value questions, but the answers have typically been to continue to provide that government subsidized transit for those broader goals. One reason I thought that was a really interesting question is there actually now is a private transit system in Raleigh that just started in North Hills. And it's operated, it's not really elaborate. It's a little loop that goes across Six Forks Road and goes through the North Hills development. It's operated by Kane, and they pay for it. I don't think they see it, by the way, as a strictly speaking for-profit enterprise. I think it's more something as a convenience to their customers and residents. But they have been operating that. We actually have been looking at, the city has been looking at ways to at least collaborate with them about that, and make sure that information about that service is available when people are using the city app, and vice versa. So could that be more something we see in the future? Potentially, it could be. In San Francisco, for instance, there has been a lot of private transit, and I think that is actually a for-profit enterprise. And so there's a few places where that works, but I think still in the United States, most cities, most places, transit would still require some kind of subsidy. And last thought on that, it's worth noting that roads and driving also are pretty heavily subsidized as well, not just in terms of direct dollars, but in indirect ways, in terms of what sometimes economists will call I'm forgetting the economist term, but basically consequences that aren't paid by the users of that service. So for driving, that would be pollution, that would be the need for more military security for oil and so on. So the transportation in general usually requires some kind of subsidy, and I think we do that just in a very general way, because it's a way to support economic activity, to get people and goods from one place to another.
Are you saying that the current law allows private companies to exist?
Yes.
So anywhere in Raleigh right now, someone could start a private bus line?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
But I
all right,
think that
that wasn't my understanding. My understanding was that it was illegal. At one time, at least, that it was illegal.
yeah, they could. I think it just would be that it would not be profitable.
Well, that would be for the investors in the company to decide, but
Sure,
it's
and
good
I
that
could be
they
wrong.
should have that
Somebody
choice.
might find a profitable way to operate that. It's possible.
Okay. Well, thank you. I have Ace is next, and Ace, I'll let you unmute yourself so I don't screw this up anymore. And then Ken has a question that I'll either read or Ken will ask himself. Ace, go ahead, please.
All right, thanks. This is something that's for years has come up. I have a sister who is a retired city planner in Santa Cruz, California. So it seems to me, my understanding is that going back to the Euclid decision in the 1950s or 1960s, that the Supreme Court decided that the individual rights of a property owner were outweighed by the collective rights of their neighbors. My question is, how can zoning laws best balance those rights? If I'm a property owner, where do my rights end and where do my neighbors' rights begin? And what is the proper balance from your perspective? And I think it's very brave of you to come here, because I think as libertarians we automatically think city planners are, you know, some kind of an evil thing. So I want to thank you for being here. But if Jason, if you can tell us what is the best way to balance those rights of the individual owner versus their neighbors?
That's a great question. That goes right to the heart of it, right? That goes right to the heart of what's a reasonable way to address those values of public health, welfare, safety, and so on. And it's been contested ground. And I mentioned the key zoning, Supreme Court decision about zoning, but there have been other ones that have kind of set parameters on that. And when cities have gone too far, as perceived by the court, and restricting uses or limiting the use of property, there have been times where they have been pushed back and saying, okay, no, that would constitute a complete taking of someone's property, and that's not permissible. Or if a city is looking to extract some kind of fees in exchange for being able to use the property, if they're too much or they're too unrelated to the use of the property, that's been struck down. But ultimately, the answer to that question is a political answer. It's a community answer. And I do think the best way to answer it, though, is to make sure that whenever that question is being discussed, that we are all the participants in the decision are thinking, one, about what are our real values as a community, and what are the implications, including some not obvious implications of certain decisions that are made. So I would go back to that example of the trade-offs that we've talked about in that transit land use planning process. So some people might say, well, changing the zoning near a transit station is bad because it will allow change around the station, taller buildings, and so on. And that's a valid perspective. But it's important to think about the consequences of that. It means that if development doesn't happen near transit, it's going to happen in a place where it's not near transit and people are more likely to drive. And again, that may be fine, but it's just important to think through those consequences and I think for a long time, we didn't really have to do that because cities were happy to kind of spread out. That met the needs of the market, and commutes were still manageable. But now both of those fundamental conditions are starting to change. Once people get past 30 minutes or so, I think they start looking really hard for other options, including living closer to where they work. And I think more people now are looking for that kind of lifestyle. So it's forced cities into a conversation now about these, and it's a reconsideration of that question that you're asking. And again, I think the important thing is that people recognize all the consequences of whatever position that they take on that issue, and it's helpful if someone has a perspective on that to make sure that that's brought out in the conversation.
Thank you. Our next question will be from Ken. Here's Ken. Hello,
Yeah.
Ken.
Hello. Yeah, it's It's interesting you brought up a couple interesting points. One are the kind of the second order effects that additional roads may cause. And then also you brought up the kind of cost of car ownership as a barrier for people, I guess specifically people in a lower socioeconomic status. But my question is, how when you're analyzing the correct mix of transit versus car ownership, and you're analyzing where that transit should go, an example being that, say, a single mother who commutes to work using transit, and her commute takes an extra hour when you consider both directions. So she has an extra hour of childcare that she needs to pay for. When you start to incorporate some of those costs that the I guess, inconvenience and infrequency that transit often has, when those costs are included, car ownership for some people actually becomes a much better value than purchasing transit. So the question is, when you're making that analysis, when you're talking about routes and frequency and things like that, how often are those second order effects included in that analysis?
That's a good question. Sometimes it's hard to capture them in a really specific way, but it's something that we always try to think about. That's a good example that you brought up, and I think that's an example of why many people do choose car ownership. It just works better for a lot of people. But I guess the fundamental answer to that question is probably simpler than it might seem. In terms of planning those transit routes, most of those are simply going along the routes. Where the routes that are planned for bus rapid transit or more frequency, those are the routes that have the highest ridership right now. Also looking at routes where there may be more housing built in the future. So looking into the future to an extent that way, that's definitely part of the equation, but a lot of it just on current transit ridership.
Okay, thank you. Dee, you're next. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, please.
Sorry, that was a mistake. I'm good. Can you pass?
Okay. Yeah, no worries. So, do you have a question, or do you want to take a pass? I'll take that as a pass. We'll go to Brad and come back to Dee if she changes her mind. Brad, go ahead, please. Brad, unmute yourself.
Working on it. There's like 3 places where the mute button or the mute mic is there, and it's hard to figure out which one is the right one. First of all, I'm speaking as the parent of a city planner and married to another city planner, and I can testify that there are socially positive things that urban planners can do. So, but I have a question. It is not a real estate property related question, but and Travis has already anticipated me a little bit in the comments. But car usage doesn't necessarily mean car ownership, right? We have the advent of the ride-sharing industry, which I think it's fair to say has had a pretty noticeable impact on Raleigh. Although I'd certainly be interested in whether my impression that that's true is borne out by the data that the urban planners are looking at. But as we look into the future, and we're looking at potentially driverless Uber cars that can be on the road, 23 out of 24 hours, as opposed to something that's driven by a human that's only maybe 12 hours a day at most, and probably should be less than that. And of course, there's an extra passenger in those cars because they don't need a driver. So you start to really see the potential for some efficiency, particularly when you can, on your app, you can order it to come to your house every day at 8:15 to pick you up to go to work, and you don't have to be ordering it every day individually. You can even program it to come 15 minutes early on Thursday so you can pick up your dry cleaning. I mean, you begin to see that there is the potential for that to make an impact, to have an impact. And if we factor in electric cars and reducing the emissions, it does seem like there would be some flexibility there, and maybe would enable some folks to live in houses without owning cars, because the efficiency and and convenience of the ride sharing service would be so great. I wonder if that is a factor that you guys are looking at.
Jason, you still with us?
Yeah. Sorry, everybody. I lost my connection for a minute. The power went out, but it's back on.
Okay.
So do I need to
maybe I'll
repeat my question, and you
Yeah,
want
I'm
to
sorry.
summarize it for me, David?
Yeah, I was
in abbreviated form. Let's hit the high points there, because I think he's familiar. I've talked to him before. He's familiar with the question.
I'm sorry, do you want me to repeat it?
Yes, I didn't hear the question.
Please.
Okay. Basically, I'm wondering how you guys take into account ride sharing, given the fact that clearly it has had an impact in Wake County in general, Raleigh in particular, I think, and going into the future, if you're looking at the potential advent of driverless cars, which can take an extra passenger, stay on the road 23 hours out of the day, probably much more so than the current driver-driven cars, and maybe electric vehicles. So we're talking about less pollution. All those things might make car-related transportation more convenient, practical, and inexpensive. Certainly for people, individuals, and potentially as an alternative to some of the more top-heavy modes of transportation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we're still so early in that process of adoption of those technologies. Obviously, ride sharing is starting to be pretty significant, and there's been some analyses that it's decreased transit use in some places, which again may be just reflective of what is working better for people. In terms of automated vehicles, it's hard to. There's a lot of potential there, but it's hard to really get a sense of what that will look like. It could be that combined with ride sharing, maybe it takes vehicles off the streets. Maybe I have a subscription and it works out a route where I can get where I'm going and pick up one or two other people on the way. And that saves me money and I don't have to own a car. Conversely, it may be that it's easier because I don't necessarily have the frustration of driving through traffic. Maybe I live further away, and maybe there's more cars on the roads. A little hard to know right now what the implications will be, except that they probably will be pretty significant. And the one thing that we have talked about is we ought to be thoughtful and deliberate about what we want. I think the one thing that did happen that probably planners would have done differently after World War II is be a little bit more thoughtful about the implications of widespread driving and doing so much planning around driving. An example being with a lot of highways being cut through cities, what were the negative consequences of that? And I think that's the kind of question that would play out again if that does lead to more driving, more trips. A downside could be, are there negative impacts? If they're electric, maybe there's not so much of a carbon or pollution impact. If they're not, there could be, but also impact in terms of walkability in places where if there's a whole lot more, if there's widened roads or more vehicles, that might have a negative consequence. So just being a little bit more deliberate about the kind of city that as a whole we want to live in.
Okay, thank you. We'll do a few more questions if you still have the juice. One of the questions that came up, maybe she wasn't comfortable reading it or is, but could you talk about just gentrification as far as like in general when somebody says an area is gentrifying or this is an example of gentrification, what's kind of implied, and maybe even talk about the areas in Raleigh where that's of greatest concern, just to provide some context around the term and where we see that process kind of unfolding here in the city of Raleigh.
Sure, it's a major issue in Raleigh, and certainly in certain parts of the city, it's maybe the top issue for people. People are concerned about higher rents and more expensive homes and their ability to continue to live in the place where they've been living. So that's something that we hear an awful lot about, and something that I think planning has to respond to, because it is such a significant issue for so many people in Raleigh. In terms of defining it, I think it is when you have very rapid increases in land values, and a lot of that is driven by the kind of processes that I talked about earlier, where you've got a scarcity of housing, where you've got changes in preferences about where people want to live compared to generations past. And it's not an easy issue to resolve, frankly, but it's one that I know that from a planning perspective, we're going to be addressing pretty significantly going into the future.
If I may, I'm the one that asked the question. This is Denise. As you probably know, it's a major problem in Charlotte, as it also is in Raleigh. When you have a growing economy and people coming in who have high skills, high wage jobs, and they need a place to live. So it's only natural for the market to respond to the needs of those people with, higher rent housing. The problem, which I think we've become painfully aware during COVID, is that we need the lower wage, low skill workers. Okay? We need them. And the question is then, what can be done to make sure that those people can serve us, that's in quotes, and not have to live under the bridge because there's no affordable housing? Now, I've seen a study that says that in Charlotte, the average rent for a 2-bedroom modest is $1,100. Now, if you're a low-wage worker, you might make $1,000 a month. The landlords require that you make 3 times your rent in income to be even approved for the housing. And another study says that in order to have and afford the rent of a 2-bedroom, you need to make $23 an hour. So do you have a thought about, what do we do about this?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's 2 fundamental ways that can be addressed, and I know that the city will be exploring both of these ways pretty significantly. One is to allow more housing. As land gets more valuable, and let's think for a second about what makes land valuable. It's, for the most part, unless it's a swamp or something that is very difficult to use, the value is determined by what it's near, what's around it. If land is accessible to jobs and parks and great places, that's what creates the value. It's not the dirt itself, it's what you can access with it. So in a sense, it's the city itself that has created that value. And as that value increases, per unit, per acre, per whatever, the only way to really fundamentally address that from this one perspective is to allow it to be shared across more housing units. So if in a high value area, only 1 house can be built per acre, that's going to be a pretty expensive house. If that same, because the value is mostly coming from the land. If that cost of the land can be spread across 10 units or 100 units, then each one of those is going to be less expensive, all else being equal. So that's part of it. The other big factor is a direct or some form of subsidy for affordability. That's also something that the city has done and is likely to continue to do. In fact, there's probably going to be a bond on the ballot in this fall for a direct provision of affordable housing. So if that can be done directly through taxpayer funds, or it can be done a little bit more indirectly through zoning, and that's kind of the example that I talked about before, where in exchange for allowing more height or more units, a certain percentage of those units would have to be affordable. So those affordable units aren't coming for free. Obviously, they're having to be paid for. It's just a less direct way of subsidizing them. So those are the two main ways. And I guess the last thing I would mention is that probably the relevant metric isn't just housing affordability per se, but because our transportation costs are closely tied, if not completely tied with where we live, looking at housing and transportation costs together. So for instance, even if, say, an apartment near bus rapid transit costs a little bit more, if that enables somebody to do away with a car or any car at all, then their combined housing and transportation costs might be lower than living in a place that's further away, but that requires a car and more driving and the costs that come with that, especially if you factor in potentially even time. So I think the affordability problem is one that actually is not shared equally across the country. There's Raleigh, there's Charlotte, there's Seattle, there's Portland. There's the cities that are really booming because their core industries are doing well: healthcare, tech, education, and so on. And then there's a lot of cities that don't have that economic base and don't have that same problem. But for the cities that do have that as an issue, it's a very pressing one, and one that I'm sure the city of Raleigh is going to focus on for quite some time.
All right, thank you. I guess I'm going to ask a question and then close this out. We sort of touched on the history of zoning, and of course, especially in the context of the last couple of weeks. If you could talk about redlining as a component of that. I mean, you talked about, freeways and where they went. There's, why 147 is where it is in Durham is a perfect example of where those highways got built, why certain areas and neighborhoods look the way they do. So if you could just explain the term redlining, because this is an important term that I think everybody should understand and kind of its context as far as history.
Yeah, that's a really good question, especially in this moment. And there's been a lot of research and understanding recently. Of course, some people have understood this for a really long time because they live with it, but I think a much greater understanding about the role of race in where people live, in the space of our cities. And that's come in the form of access to financing. It's come in the form of restrictive covenants, come in the form of zoning, and how that's been applied in different ways. But the question about redlining is a good one, and that literally you can find maps where areas, it's a very literal term. There are maps where areas were colored red and deemed to be not places to lend money to. So, and these maps were created by the federal government, and it essentially locked out those residents from access to capital and the opportunity to generate wealth that could have provided. And those maps, if you overlay them against different maps that show all sorts of things, they match up very consistently. They show demographically where people live. And so that legacy of redlining still shapes our cities today. And the flip side of that is those racially restrictive covenants. I know that some people have been surprised in Raleigh to find out that they lived in a place that very explicitly did not allow residents of different races to live there. And that's obviously not enforceable today, but did that shape that neighborhood and its history? Yes, it did. So there's been quite a legacy of race, and I think it behooves everybody to think about that in the context of any decision about planning and land use, because it still is a legacy that shapes our cities and our society today.
All right, thank you. I appreciate having you speaker. Sorry I blanked. I had with these squares in front of me, I had one person's name in front of me and just kind of got confused. So I apologize, Denise. For going back to Denise's point as we close this out, In the city of Raleigh, an area around North Hills, the zoning, there's neighborhood conservation overlay districts, which are very restrictive as far as what can be built to replace existing homes. And there is a lot of still of that single family zoning. There are a lot of people that would love to live around North Hills with all those shops and all the amenities there. But because it can only be a single family home, many of the neighbors and long-term existing residents always seem dismayed that the old house that was 2,000 square feet and 50 years old gets torn down, or 40 years old, gets replaced with a 4,500 square foot McMansion. And that's simply the zoning and the regulation. The market simply has no opportunity in the city of Raleigh to respond with a triplex or maybe taking 3 lots and putting in a row of townhomes. ADUs aren't even allowed now. So if the zoning only allows a single family home, that home, if that land is expensive like it is around North Hills, is going to be a huge home, and it's going to be targeted at somebody who can afford an $800,000 or $900,000 home. We see, I even see it happening. Brad sees it happening in his own cul-de-sac, you know, as what can go in and be replaced here in the Northridge area. So for us as libertarians, if we're talking about property rights, if the market had an opportunity to allow property to be developed to meet market demand, I mean, there are developers, there are people out there that would love to build denser housing that would make the mass transit and the transportation plans more effective in many areas, and it would change a development pattern which has its own costs with sprawl. I mean, the other thing you'll hear about this is the sprawl, and that's where Roseville and Apex and all these places, well into Harnett County, you have people that commute into RTP from Fayetteville. That all exists because the housing costs around North Hills continue to skyrocket, which is a result of zoning, which is a result of small groups of politically active neighbors who used to operate in things called CACs, getting organized and deciding that they were going to stop development in their area. And for those of you who haven't been on one of these meetings before, I talk more during this one because this is actually something I'm probably most passionate about. Not that I don't care about our other focus issues for NCGA, but this is one that really hits millennials hard. So when you're out there as an NCGA candidate for Libertarian Wake County, remember, this is having a huge impact on people under 40 staying in Raleigh. Remember, 2 of our candidates from last year, Richard Haygood and Robin, they moved out of Wake County to find their first house. And so that is something that needs to be understood. The people that we want to be the future of the WakeLP, young people that, you know, embrace liberty, when they go to buy their first home, they can't live in Wake County in many ways because they're having a hard time finding housing they can afford. And so it hits us in many ways, and there's direct examples. So anyway, that's all I have. Does anybody have an alibi they want to put in the chat window that I have forgotten, an announcement maybe to do or anything like that? No? All right.
Can I
Jason,
ask
I really appreciate, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Back to redlining for a second. I just wondered, is there clarification that that is no longer occurring and that lenders aren't allowed to redline areas? So if they were, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So anybody, because Fannie Mae, anybody who is FHFA compliant, are they allowed to redline areas?
No. No, that's something, now, do all lenders make decisions without taking into account some of those considerations? I don't know. I mean, I think there still are actively discriminatory practices out there, but redlining the way that it was practiced historically, where it was actually a government generated issue, no, that does not happen. And of course, there is now much more of a focus on watching lending and watching those kinds of practices to make sure that they're not discriminatory. But I think we'd be naive to think that they're extinct.
Okay. Well, again, Jason, thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, because we weren't in person, what you missed out on was your WakeLP provided dinner, beer. Usually get a pint glass or something. So I'll have to find some way to make it up to you. But at some point, I hope to get to another one of your presentations that is in person and attended live. So again, appreciate everything you do for the city of Raleigh. And I'm going to wrap up the meeting because I think we are done at this point. Amy, you could probably stop